que compartirán con ella un panel realmente muy calificado sobre esta temática. Al final, como dije al principio, vamos a tener un espacio para estar entre todos participando con preguntas y respuestas y probablemente demos por terminado la cosa entre las 6:15 y 6:30, dependiendo también un poco de ustedes. And now, Pam, please, the floor is yours. You can start your presentation. Thank you for being with us.
Okay, thank you. And thank you for that introduction. I do want to make sure, can everyone see what is on my screen now at this point? It's still up?
We see you.
Oh, you can see me. So okay, let me share my screen then. All right. Can you now see my PowerPoint presentation?
We see your presentation and we see part of the next slide you will share with us.
Okay, so let's see. I think I want to share this up here then. No, this is not it. I apologize. I thought we had it set up.
Yeah, we had added, but don't worry, it's not so. Marcelo, what is that? Ah, there it is. That's
okay. All right, great. Just wanted to make sure I had the right one. Okay, so first of all, thank you for the introduction. And I unfortunately do not speak fluent Spanish, so this has to be in English today. I am here today to talk to everyone about compliance in general, but really to talk about compliance from the perspective of someone that's served as a monitor. And I think what's important about that is there's this recognition that there is not an unlimited amount of resources or money or individuals to work on compliance at any company. No matter what your size, no matter how big your compliance department is, there's always a limited amount of money and resources available. And decisions have to be made about what is critical and how to go about compliance. And so that's what we're really going to talk about today, is that if you had a monitor and a monitor came because the company had some issues, what would they really be looking at? Because those are probably some of the critical areas that you should be spending part of your resources on to get your compliance program in appropriate shape. And before we start, what I want to do is recognize that this is not something that's unique to the United States. We see a lot of activity in Argentina over the last couple of few years, where Argentina is very focused on compliance programs, and in fact now has criminal liability against corporate entities since I guess March of 2018. You all have received a great amount of guidance from your own government about what should be in a compliance program. And so here, I just outlined at the beginning about where Argentina is in this process, because I recognize I'm a US lawyer. I'm speaking to you about the US law, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. But I think it's very important to see that there's this relationship of what is happening in the US and all the progress that's being made in Argentina. So what I want to do right before we start really talking about this is to ask one survey question. And then I want to make sure I know what the process, I think it's going to appear on everybody's screens.
Marcelo, subís la primera pregunta, por favor.
Okay, so the question here is, for everybody in the audience, do you think an FCPA related prosecution is a serious risk for an Argentinian company listed only on the Buenos Aires Stock Exchange? And I think, okay, so I'm gonna write, so yes, people believe that there's a serious risk of a violation or that you could be prosecuted for an FCPA violation, 58% and 42%. And this is, the question here is that is obvious that what we're asking is if you are not listed on a US stock exchange, but you're only listed on the Buenos Aires Stock Exchange. So this is where the poll comes out, is 58 to 42. So we'll be discussing this and coming back to it as the day progresses. But let's go to, do I hit share results so everyone can see it? Or is that controlled by you all?
No, it's controlled by us. Marcelo, deja de, por favor, sacar los resultados de la votación.
Okay. All right, so I think everyone can now see the results. And what we start with this question because obviously I'm here to talk about the FCPA, as are Romero and Maria from Volkswagen and Baker Hughes later on today. We wanted to get a general understanding of whether people thought that the FCPA was a real risk for companies. So what we're going to do is now we're going to talk a little bit about the FCPA. And here, I think everybody in the audience probably has a basic understanding of the FCPA. What most people do think of it as, though, is if there is a bribe to a government official or an attempted bribe. And of course, it's any government official anywhere around the world, with the exception of a US government official, because in the US we have different laws that we would prosecute individuals for that. It wouldn't fall under a foreign bribe from the US perspective. And then the second one I think most people are familiar with, because that is the books and record violation. That most companies that get in trouble don't want to admit that they paid a bribe or they tried to pay a bribe. So they end up negotiating a violation of the books and records, meaning that somehow their books and records were inaccurate or misleading. So it could be that they didn't record it as a bribe, even though it was in fact a bribe, or it could be that they have other issues with some of their reporting. And now all of that is subject to negotiation at the time with the SEC and the DOJ. The third one, most people don't ever really think about. You can be prosecuted if the US has jurisdiction for failure to implement sufficient internal controls. So there is actually no bribe violation, and potentially you could have accurate books and records, but what you don't have are sufficient internal controls. And internal controls are those things that are meant to prevent a bribe from happening. And you read lots of things and you always see people talk about the first two, but what they don't talk about is the third. And what's important about that third is those first two slides where I discussed what's happening in Argentina, and that Argentina is also requiring some form of compliance and giving guidance on that. So it looks like a corporate entity could be prosecuted in Argentina and the US if you fail to have insufficient internal controls. Okay. So let's go to the next slide. Okay. And so why does the FCPA matter? The first, we just asked, 58% of the audience thought it was a risk of you could be prosecuted if you were not listed on a US stock exchange. You were only listed on a Buenos Aires. And so what this slide tells you is who is subject to the FCPA. So of course, if you're a US citizen, a US national, a US resident, and you reside anywhere, or you're traveling anywhere in anywhere in the entire world, you are subject to this law. That's easy, we all expect that. The next one is if you're a US company or your headquarters are located in the US. Also pretty easy to guess that there is jurisdiction over them. And the third, the obvious category, if you're an issuer. Where we get into the areas that some people don't understand is that if you are an agent, so you are some third-party consultant that's been hired by a US company, and you are in Argentina. So you're a third party that's going to help them obtain land. And you as a third party, even though you are in Argentina the entire time, because you are working with a US company that is subject to the FTPA, you, during all of your conduct related to that work with that US entity or that US person or that US listed company, everything you do will be subject to the FTPA. And so it could be your company or it could be an individual. The next one is anytime you travel into the United States. Sounds like that makes sense, but I'm going to give you a couple examples on the next slides, because I think what people don't think through is just how far the jurisdiction of the FTPA goes, and why maybe that answer of the 58% think that a company is at risk, really it should be a substantially higher number. And then the last one is, it's interesting, and it has happened, and companies have been prosecuted for this, is are you a successor? Meaning you acquired an entity that long before you bought them, they committed some acts that were in violation of the FTPA. You as the successor, you as the entity that acquired that company or the subsidiary or whatever it is, you are liable for all of those acts. It's called successor liability. And then, so we move on to the next slide. And so again, here's the first example. So issuers, I'm actually going to pass by this one because I think we all really kind of understand if you choose to list on the US stock exchange, you're choosing to be subject to its laws. The next one is, what if you're a subsidiary or you're an individual that works at a private subsidiary that's based in Argentina? So it's a US company, it's not listed on a US stock exchange, but it has a subsidiary down in Argentina. If you work there, if you work at that private subsidiary company, and you never traveled to the US, you never used any email that went through the US, you never used any US banks, but you, in your capacity as an employee of this company, you offered to pay a bribe to an Argentinian government official using only Argentinian pesos. And it was done on behalf of your Argentinian company, you could be prosecuted. So just think through that. It's not even a public company, it's a subsidiary. You never touch US soil yourself, nothing you do ever touches US soil, but you're gonna be subject to it, the law. Same thing with an agent. That's what I was talking about earlier. Same scenario. The agent actually just has to work with a US company, and it could be a private company. It doesn't have to be a public company. This happened recently in the Alstrom case. I'm not going to go through the details of that case, but there was a prosecution under an agency theory. It has been relitigated. The courts have, the appeal was upheld. So I don't want to go through the specifics. But what it taught us is that this law is incredibly expansive, and what the US government may choose to prosecute is very, very substantial everywhere in the world. And then this last one, this is one, it actually has been prosecuted on numerous occasions, and it's interesting. So this one, there's not even a US company involved. There's no US company, no US citizen, no US money, no anything that ever touches the US. But your employee happens to want to bribe a government official, and say they're arranging the payment through an assistance, through their assistant, and the assistant happens to be in the US, and you text them while they're in the US, that's enough. You can get prosecuted, and this has actually happened because the US government says, if you're going to be on our US soil, we don't want you doing anything that would violate one of our laws. And so this, it's hard to put your arms around, but you're Argentinian citizen, you work at an Argentinian company, you do no work with any US company at all. you've never been to the US, you personally have never used any US banks, you personally have no contacts whatsoever, but you happen to text somebody one time while they're passing through the US, that is enough. And the US will prosecute that person, and they will prosecute the company that that person works for. So that's why I think at the beginning we asked that very first survey question, because I think sometimes people don't understand how aggressive this law is. So now we're going to move on, now that we've had a little better understanding of how far the reach is and why in Argentina it matters today. And that is when a company gets in trouble, we see this, they publicly have somehow violated the FCPA. So they either have a books and records problem, they actually paid a bribe, or they could have a failure of their controls. They don't have sufficient internal controls. And so they get prosecuted. And not every company ends up with a monitor. Some do. And for those that aren't familiar with what a monitor is, a monitor is appointed by the US government. It is either by the DOJ or the SEC in most circumstances. And they are appointed to oversee the remediation efforts of a company that has been in trouble. And that remediation effort is typically for a 3-year period. So the monitor comes in and reviews your entire compliance program from the top down and the bottom up. And I'll explain what that means in a minute. And so having been a monitor on 3 occasions, I can tell you that what we look at and what we request is a lot more than just your policies. But before we get there, I want to explain to everybody what our US government would look at before they decide they're going to put a monitor in place. And by the way, the monitor is not a government official, but they also are not a lawyer for the company. So there is no privilege. There's no privilege of the work that they do. So when you're a monitor, you have to take precautions to make sure your materials don't get leaked and they aren't accidentally discovered outside, because we are clearly looking at a company's sensitive information. But when does the US government decide that a monitor is necessary? And this is important for those of you that are working in compliance programs and you are trying to structure them, because you need to understand what are deemed to be the bad things. What would cause you to have a monitor? And so the first one, there's 4 factors, and they are actually outlined in the Department of Justice manual. And it tells you what the government looks at. The government first tries to decide, was the underlying misconduct, did it involve any manipulation of the company's books and records? And I put little bullets down here because I want you to understand when they're asking about that, what they're asking is, how is this compliance program structured? Is there actually an ability to circumvent rules and manipulate the books and records? Or is there an absence of rules? Or is it that no one follows the rules? So that's what that first category, and that is, they look at everything. The structure is not just the pieces of paper that have your policies on it. It is the overarching structure and how it's organized. The second thing that the government looks at, and this is important as you're establishing your compliance programs, is, was the conduct pervasive? And how high up in the organization did it go? This is what we call the tone at the top. If you have senior leadership that approved or participated in the conduct, you are more likely going to get a monitor, because that means that the government, the US government, is not going to trust your organization to get things right. Because if it goes all the way up the chain, the more senior it gets, the more likely they will want an independent third party in there for a number of years to make sure that changes are happening and the tone is proper. The third thing our government, the US government, would look at is, what was the root cause? Meaning, what caused the original violation to happen? Does the company know what that is? And if they did they put any improvements in place? Did they actually recognize what caused the problem? Not just rogue employees, but where the gap was in the program, and did they try to fix it? So they look for evidence of improvements. And I promise you, what they are not looking for are your written policies. That is assumed that you have those. What I'm talking about in the improvements are internal control improvements. So, and we'll talk about those in a minute, but that really relates to your finances and what controls are in the finances. And so compliance is not just the rules of how do you get approvals to make payments for gifts or travel. It is that back end of the financial controls of a company, and it is expected that a truly effective compliance program and the individuals in compliance will understand the financial controls of a company. And then the last thing is, let's say that we see that there's all these improvements, but was it effectively implemented? That is going to be a topic that we discuss with Ramiro and Maria later on. And the effective implementation is about going out and doing your risk assessments and testing and looking at your data and seeing, was it implemented, and do we need to improve it even further? So those are the 4 factors our US government will look at when they decide if you have to have a monitor. And then this goes back to, what is the monitor's role? The monitor's role is defined inside of the settlement agreement. So if any of you are ever curious, you can go to any agreement where a monitor was imposed, and it will actually have inside of the deferred prosecution agreement. For those that don't have a practice in the US, a deferred prosecution agreement means the government elects to allow you to plead guilty, but it doesn't get entered as a judgment. They're deferring the prosecution. But if you mess up and you don't fulfill the obligations during the monitorship, that becomes an actual enforceable plea of guilty. So, but the deferral period is the monitorship period. And if you successfully complete the case, then no longer becomes a criminal plea. Of course, there are some companies that have to plead guilty, but typically the US government prefers to go with the deferred prosecution route. And the monitor's mandate is to assess the company's compliance with the agreement, meaning the actual settlement agreement with the Department of Justice and the SEC, and to look at their corporate compliance program and test its effectiveness. So here is what the monitor does. Just quickly, they look to see, do you have measures to prevent? Do you have measures to detect a violation? And if you do, can you effectively remediate? And remember, at least in the US, the government doesn't expect any company to be perfect. You will have problems. There will be people that circumvent your rules, but what they do expect is that you have the ability to detect that, and you have the ability to remediate it, to figure out how that occurred and to fix it, and to most likely fire or terminate all relationship with those employees. Okay. So this is when I go in as a monitor, I don't ask for just your policies and procedures. This is generally the list of things that I'm going to ask for. And so this is, you as a compliance organization or department, you need to understand that when you're creating your program, all of these things will matter. And these are the things that any monitor would ask for. And your own country's guidance documents discuss most of these categories. So one, we're going to discuss with our panelists that are joining us in just a few minutes. And that is, how is your group organized? Who do you report to? And then the second category is your access or your frequency of reporting. Access is part of the first category. How are you organized? Who do you report to? And then the second thing we'll discuss with the panelists is the risk assessments. Are you actually doing a risk assessment? Are you mapping your risks? Are you Are you making process changes as a result of finding those risks? And those risk assessments earlier when I said that there is not an unlimited amount of money. And because there isn't, you have to decide what are your biggest risks, and that's where you use your resources and your personnel. For some companies, the biggest risk may be their third-party distributor channel network. So they need to spend 80% of their funds on that process, and maybe not really spend much money on looking at your $100 gift limits. Some companies we found historically that the easiest things to look at are things like your gift limits and your percentage of people who have completed training. I can tell you as a monitor, in the 3 cases I had, neither of those latter 2 categories were critical to my review. They mattered, I asked the question, but that is not where my recommendations fell. They typically fell in whatever I deemed to be the highest risk categories. And the other things that a monitor will ask for, and I did, was how do you do your investigations? Who runs them? What's your process? How do you document them? What is your training? It is something I said I'd ask about. Your compliance monitoring. Are you actually monitoring your own program? Are you monitoring the effectiveness of it? This page covers the other parts, the financial controls. These get asked. These are important. These are probably some of the most important questions that any monitor will ask. And that is, what is your internal audit program looking at? Internal audit is not monitoring the success of your compliance program. They are monitoring whether or not in their audits, people are following the rules. So we will always ask for that. The internal financial controls. So earlier when I was saying that that is probably the highest risk area for every company, that's because that's the money in and money out. That's how bribes get paid. It comes either when it's coming in and somehow you gave a write-off that was inappropriate because you were trying to keep more money at your distributor because they were paying a bribe, or you're giving inappropriate discounts, or on the procure to pay. That's where those controls, that ability to onboard a vendor or a supplier into your system, that is where the vast majority of a monitor's time will focus. Those areas. Where are your financial controls? Okay. All right, so the next area, we're going to have our panelists join us in just a minute, and we're going to talk about those first 2 categories, the organization and structure, what it looks like, how they are doing it, what they find successful, whether they've had to make changes. And then we're going to talk about your risk mapping. How do you do it and why? We're going to hear from 2 companies that have had monitors, or one that currently has one right now. And it's very informative to hear from people that have monitors about what compliance looks like and what they should be doing and where they're allocating their resources. But before we get there, we are going to move on to survey question number 2. Okay. All right, so let everybody read it, but it is for our compliance officers. I know we have some people that are in-house counsel, or I'm sorry, not in-house counsel, but we have some people that are law firms, and this question is really directed to our compliance people, and we want to know, who do the compliance officers that are here report to? I think we have probably most of the voting is in. Okay. And So this is very interesting, and it's actually a great sign. We're going to have a couple slides in a minute here that talk about why this is a great result. The board is the #1 category at 53%. So more than half of you report to a board, some to the audit committee. I am guessing that what we're going to find is that it's a dual reporting, that you may actually report into the audit committee of the board, so the special committee. So those first two are similar. Whether you report into the legal department, 15%. Internal audit, that is interesting. That is something that we don't often see in these reports. And then at a regional or a headquarter level, and that makes sense because some of our audience may that's who they individually report into, as opposed to who the compliance department as a whole reports into. Okay. All right, so now we actually have a follow-up question, and if we can move to survey question number 3. So we know who you all report to, because it was 51% board, 5% audit committee, and legal department internal audit. What we say here is, who do you think you should report to, not who you actually report to. And by the way, this question is open to all participants, not just our compliance officers. I think it would be interesting to hear what our outside counsel also believe, where a compliance department should report. Okay. All right, so it looks like most people have now voted. And I'm going to tell everyone, because I know you can't see both at the same time, but I can, or I wrote it down. Whom do you think, or whom do you actually report? We had 51% as the board. And who do you think you should report to? 80%. So a significant number believe that that's where the reporting should occur, as opposed to where it is occurring. The audit committee was 5% actually, and 10% believe that's who should be reported to. In contrast, the 14% report to the legal department, and only 7% believe that they should be reporting. And internal audit, it was 2%, and 3% believe that they should report, as opposed to the 2% that actually do. So this is very, very informative information. I appreciate everybody participating in this. We're going to move to a little bit of a discussion on the boards right before our panelists get start. And very quickly, why do you have a compliance function? Obviously, you know, I just wrote it all out here, and who the potential people are, or the individuals you should report to. And then I'm not going to go through this, but I included it for anybody that wants to see it. You can refer to the various sources that are saying where the US government believes compliance should be reporting. Just so you know, they do not dictate where it should be reported, where compliance should report. But when you read the guidance documents, it is fairly clear that where they would prefer is that the board, you report into the board. That is, while they do not dictate it, and they're very careful to say that every company will be different, when you read the guidance that I provided for you, if you ever want to look it up, that is what the conclusion will be. And so now I actually would like to introduce our two panelists that are here. And we'll start with Ramiro. Ramiro Cabrero is the Global Compliance Officer at Baker Hughes. And I'm going to allow him to give some background on himself. And it would be helpful, Ramiro, if you can talk about, you know, the time period that you had a monitor and what that experience was like.
Okay, thank you, Pam. Thank you, Matthias, for the invitation. I work at Baker Hughes. I've been working here for 15 years, since 2005. The company had in the past two different settlements with the US government. The first one was in 2001 for violations occurred late in the 90s. And that derived in a cease and desist order by the DOJ and an imposition to implement a sophisticated and robust compliance program. So at that time, early 2000s, we hired a chief compliance officer and started building a stronger program, let's say. We had code of conduct and basic policies at that time. So years went by, but then we have another set of violations occurred from 2002 to 2004 that ended up in a negotiation and a settlement in 2007. So in 2007, after having the previous settlement, the U.S. government, DOJ and SEC, we had both violations in terms of different books of the FCPA, anti-bribery provisions and books and records. We had a set of penalties, including $44 million fine, a DPA, and the position of a monitor for a 3-year period, 2007-2010. So basically, when I say $44 million today, it sounds like a small amount, consider what came after that, right? But at that time, we were the largest economic fine in FCPA history, and it was the starting point for larger cases that came after our situation. So we lived with the monitor for 3 years. I must say I was already with the company, and I had responsibility over Latin America at that time. Violations did not occur in Latin America. They occurred three of them in Kazakhstan, in Angola, and Nigeria, involving third parties, basically to release custom equipment with a shorter time frame. So we paid a bribe for that. We paid a bribe through an agent to get an important contract from the Kazakhstan national oil company. So we ended up having this journey with the monitor, and as you said, Pam, the remediation activities basically involved the monitor traveling around a set of countries. For instance, of course, high-risk countries in our case in Latin America, like Brazil, like Venezuela at that time, and Mexico, and of course in the other parts of the world, they travel around 50 countries. So what they did is learning about what we had, learning in paper, learning if our people already knew and were trained about it, because we could have had a strong set of policies, but people probably were not really knowing about how to do things, right? In terms of training, communications, and so on. And finally, of course, proposing changes. And those changes were critical at some point. You talked about internal controls, right? So changes involving internal controls were connected in our case, where we have operations in very remote and isolated places, extinguishing the petty cash funds, accelerating implementation of SAP in countries where we were having plans of implementing in next 5 years. We had to accelerate that with all the headaches that might cause, restructuring the business in terms of not having a reporting line directly to the Houston office, but having like geo markets and local presence to ensure we have clear leadership and visibility in country. So it was intense. I met with Monitor actually like 5 times in different countries, and accompanied them with his entire team in the meetings. And they basically went to a country, interview like 100 people from sensitive areas, and it was intense, as you said. I mean, very first thing they said was, we're not representing the company, we're here representing the US government, and unfolding a list of questions and requests that we have to comply with. It was good. It was very important for the company. And from that moment on, we basically changed a lot. We changed the department, we changed the company and the program. And we learned that the fact that we might have had a good program at that time, it's not enough, and this is an ongoing responsibility. So having a good or best-in-class program nowadays doesn't mean you will have it tomorrow. If you don't make those changes, corruption is moving targets, and you need to keep on improving it. So that's the experience we had. After that, luckily, we never had any other conflict or issue. But we work hard towards having a stronger program every single month and year.
Great. Well, thank you, Ramiro. And I'm going to follow up on some of what you said. But before we do, I want to introduce Marita and give her the opportunity to let the audience know who she is. And her experience is a little different than yours, because she is at Volkswagen, which is just now going a mentorship. So she'll be speaking of it from the perspective of the amount of work that's involved in this process, as opposed to looking back on that time. So, Marita?
Yes, okay. Thank you very much for the invitation and the opportunity to share our experiences that we are having so far. Maybe in the future we will be able to share also the experiences that Ramiro said, but now at this moment we are a little bit suffering about this, but we are recognizing that this is really helpful. At the end, this is helping us to give and to obtain a sustainable company. Just to explain our case, we had a problem, an environmental problem, nothing to do with corruption, but it was an environmental problem. So at the end, our internal controls were failed. So that's why we were prosecuted. So it was in 2015. I joined the company in 2008 and moved to the compliance department in 2012. So 3 years. At that time, I was working for 3 years when this happened. After that, the decision to start with a monitorship started in 2017. We are supposed to finish this year. And I can tell you that there were a lot of changes, not only in processes, but also and mainly in the culture, because we are a company, a group which has 12 different brands with different cultures. So this is really a big challenge to define a single and standard procedures for different part of the business. So so far we are working hard on this. Argentina at this point of time, we are involved in the changes of the processes and recommendations of the monitorship. In all of them, We have developed a program at the group level, which is called Together for Integrity, because as I mentioned, the culture has been found as a big topic for us, especially the speak up culture it was found as a big topic to be solved. So we have developed at the group level this program to implement all around the world, and of course Argentina is one of the companies and one of the places in the world that it's mandatory to perform these activities, to perform these recommendations of the monitorship. And one of the recommendations that came from the monitorship is about, or was about, the structure of compliance, as you mentioned before. And the recommendation was to especially to ensure the independence of the compliance department. That's why in our case, in my case, we report to the local board, but also we have a dotted line with the group functions, to the group function. So this is basically our experience so far we are having, and hopefully we finish this year before the end of the year with this monitorship. What I can tell you is really tough, and the timing is really very short term, but we are now discovering that this is really helping us to make the business sustainable at the end of the time.
Great. And we're going to talk now a little more about what you both, especially you, Marisa, talked about with the compliance structure. But what I find is so interesting about hearing from the both of you is that having been a monitor, when we get placed, when we're finally selected and the U.S. government approves us, that you're always worried that the company will be resistant and they will not cooperate with you, or they will be so frustrated that they wish you weren't there. And what I've heard from both of you is that despite the fact that it's hard and it's a lot of work and it's so much more work than you expected it would be, that at the end you do feel like you're a little better. At least I think I hear that. So it's good to hear, because monitorships are hard on both sides. They really are, because a monitor is forcing you to do things that you may not want to do, but they are also dealing with the business reality of your company and trying to make recommendations that will work. But monitorships are a give and take, and they can be quite challenging on both sides. But I just moved to the next slide, and I do want to go into just a tiny bit more detail from both of you on the compliance structure. And Marisa, you talked about it a bit just now, so I think let's start with you. And why don't you tell us what the structure was like at Volkswagen before, and what the monitor recommendation read like, and then how it now looks like. Did you follow it precisely what they recommended, or were there other improvements or variations to that?
Yes, well, before the monitorship, we were really few people in the compliance department, not really much. But now, at least here in Argentina, and I also can tell you also in the group, the compliance department has increased, I don't know, but there were 20 people in the group, and now they are around 200. And in my case, we used to be 4, but I'm also not only responsible for compliance, also for risk management, but now we are the double. Yes. We are the double because of the quantity of processes and activities that we have to perform. Because at the end, also we need the resources. It's, as you mentioned, it's not only the activities in paper. We need the resources relocated to us to perform these activities. If we are supposed to take our business partners and we are supposed to take the processes inside the company, so we need the resources, we need the people there working for us. So yes, we are now at the double of the team that we used to be in the past.
And do you find, it sounds like you have more work to do, but did the monitor actually recommend an increase in headcount, or they made recommendations that because it was so much more work, you had to increase headcount?
No, the monitors made the recommendations, and we decided, of course, that the things cannot be done alone. So the decision was in the group level, in the board level, and they understood. They are very, very committed with this topic. In fact, we have to report which is the quantity of people that we hire. We have in a monthly basis and in a quarterly basis, we have to report. If we don't have the people, we have to report which is the plan. And if we don't have a plan, someone from the local board has to explain why we don't have the plan. So they took this really seriously because it's a basic topic.
And Ramiro, before I go to you, Matthias, we have seen a few hands raised, and I don't know what the process is for that, or if we wait until the end to see if there are additional questions, or.
I would say let's wait until the end to pose the questions.
All right, okay. So Ramiro, to you then, kind of the same questions that were there any changes because the monitor required it, or did the company make any changes to the structure, and how did that look, you know, at the beginning versus at the end?
Okay, no changes in terms of reporting lines at the very top level, and the reason for that was that we had a previous violation, so we had that requirement to implement a compliance program. We already had a chief compliance officer reporting to the GC, still reports to the GC, to General Counsel, and simultaneously to the board, right? So at the time when monitor came, we already had that reporting line that we still have. Now, in terms of, as Marita said, in terms of the structure, it has changed a lot. It has changed significantly. I think that we had at least 2 or more or 3 times what we had. The monitor asked the company to hire compliance officers internationally. At that time, we only had a headquarters level in Houston. So we started having a headcount in different high-risk locations, and also opened like new areas within the compliance department, like an FCPA audit team, a specific targeted due diligence team for training, for policy review. So we pretty much improved the department to a high level nowadays. And I think the challenge now, after 10 years, the monitorship ended, was, well, we tried not to lose anything, right? And to keep with that final recommendation and understanding that it's not about the 3 years when the monitor was here in this case, right? It's what about what's coming after that, right? It's pretty easy, I would say, for chief compliance officer or general counsel to persuade the board or the chief compliance or chief executive officer to implement changes that are being recommended by the monitor. Point is, what's going to happen after the monitor leaves, right? And in our case, we've been able to change the culture dramatically, and the legal department and compliance department are strong enough to persuade the CEO in the cases where the CEO might have a different view, but of course, CEO is part of the culture, and we have embedded that within the company. So the changes have been very, very important, but for the most part, I would say that we try to permeate with the culture along the different geographies. We don't have a strong risk in the U.S. compared to high risk locations like Africa, like Latin America, Middle East, and China, Russia. We do work in very sensitive locations. So I would say that we expanded what we had, and we grew in terms of headcount and level of expertise.
Okay, great. And I recognize that many of the people on the call are at companies that currently maybe don't have the resources or aren't going to have them allocated because they're not in trouble. But I think it's important to hear that companies, after monitorship is over, they still want to keep the structure in place, that it is beneficial. And sometimes having an outsider come in is one of the most impactful things that can happen at a company, because it isn't the internal compliance department that is asking for more money. It's an outsider, and it's someone that has the requisite skill set a monitor would have, that to come in and help make the board or make whoever is making the recommendations on budget, make them understand what the value is and why it's important. But I think now we're actually gonna move over to our last topic that I promised we would cover, which is risk mapping. How do you do it, and why do you do it? And before we get started with that, let's go through our survey question number 4. Okay, for everyone, the question is, does your company conduct risk assessments that, did we have a typo, that map ethics and compliance risk? So essentially, do you do risk assessments? And by the way, if anybody doesn't know what a risk assessment is, then the answer should be no. But just for edification of everyone, a risk assessment is where the company identifies someone to go through and figure out where the risks are in a company. These days we hear a lot about cybersecurity, so that for instance is a risk area. That may not be a risk area associated with corruption, but it is a risk. So I'm trying to give you examples. Other companies will try to identify our risks related to certain markets that we're in, or are they related to, we have a different business model in certain of our countries. So just while you're answering those questions, I want to make sure that everyone understood. So we have about half of the people, a little less than half, have answered, and the companies that do risk assessments are 76%, and 24% say that they do not currently do risk assessments. So we're going to move to our next survey question, question number 5, before we talk about risk assessments. Okay, and then for the 76% that said that they do risk assessments, it would be helpful to know who is in charge of the risk assessment process. And that's probably, I think that about matches the number of people that said yes, that they do. So it looks like compliance is the clear winner here, that 54% of the risk assessments done by the companies here are led by compliance, which, by the way, is about equal to the number of companies that also said compliance reports into the board. And I didn't ask this question as a survey, but my assumption is that more of those that do these risk assessments are doing them and are also reported into the board. The internal audit, 17% of you, that's who does your risk assessments. 21% is done by risk management group. And Marita, that might be your secondary role. I think you said you do risk. Third parties, so you outsource this to a third party, that's 3%. And then the other, it would be interesting at some point to be able to figure out what this other is. We threw that in because we weren't sure that everyone would meet with one of those other categories, but I'm surprised by that number, that there are 5 that report to other, or that are conducted by other. So, okay, so let's move on to the next slide here then. Okay, here we go. Okay, so risk mapping. For the 76% of you that do it, you probably already understand the reason. And I put together this slide, and I was thinking, I originally wrote it as you do it because the government expects that you're going to do it. And then I realized, well, that's not the real reason you should do this. You should do this because it's actually a good business practice to do it. But it is also a good reason to do it, because if you ever get in harm's way and go awry of the FTPA, one of the very first questions you will be asked and will be addressed, remember back to the 4 reasons people get monitors, companies get monitors, and they talk about the effectiveness of your compliance program. This is one of the things that they will be asking about to determine if your program is effective. And in fact, it's discussed in the US has what's called sentencing guidelines. So if you get in trouble, the sentencing guidelines will talk about risk assessment, risk mapping. They're going to ask you about how often you do it. The Department of Justice manual, for those that don't know, that document is used by members of the Department of Justice. So the attorneys that work at the Department of Justice have a manual, and it tells, and they review that when they're making decisions on whether to prosecute or not. By the way, the sentencing guidelines are what the judicial system uses when they are handing down a sentence. But they're also the guidelines that are used when you're negotiating with government lawyers. They will use those guidelines. And then most of you are probably familiar with the corporate compliance program guidance document. But anyway, these are the reasons that you should do your risk assessments. And number one is it's just good practice. And then let's go to our panelists on this. I want to, Ramiro, go back to you on risk assessments. So over at Baker Hughes, did the company do risk assessments way back in 2007 when you first had the monitorship? Is this something that pre-existed that, or is it just something you do now?
Short answer is yes. Now I think we gain in terms of having risk assessment at a region and country level, when at that time we only had headquarter risk assessment. Let me first say that apart from the government reason or the regulatory reason for risk assessment, there is a business reason, right? We are a business organization. We are a risk management area. So we not only need to ask for resources, meaning headcount or systems, but we have an obligation also, and our credibility is based on that, to adequately allocate those resources, right? So that's the very aim and a target of the risk assessment. Now, what we do, as I said, we had a global risk assessment within compliance group and teaming sometimes with the audit teams as well. And we combine internal and external information, like, well, can be revenue, headcount, number of third parties we have, the number of the activity we have in certain places, also some external information as well. What's the corruption risk in a particular country, if we are dealing with a public customer mostly, or private companies. So we combine and compile all that information. Of course, we have heat maps, and once we have the global information, we go down. Of course, we contrast that information and discuss that information with senior leadership at first time, and then we go down to regions. We unfold that headquarters information at a region and at a country level, only for high-risk countries, and we somehow mirror the exercise, right? Ended up having different lists and heat maps and material to discuss with local and region managers. And also, of course, we are, and this is the basis for this, we end up customizing the communications, the trainings, the materials based on those results, right? So that's the annual exercise we conduct. It's constantly feeding, and every time we learn about a new risk, that is pretty often, and we try to adjust and to reflect that into the risk assessment, whether local or regional, in depending where it fits.
And in the process, you said sometimes you find new risks. Do you sometimes realize old risks aren't as important anymore and they get moved down in the priority levels, or?
Well, it might happen. It might happen. For instance, one of the information that we pull is the enforcement cases, right? But if enforcement cases are old enough not to be at least directly impacting in the final result, they might be more informative than making part of the final number. So that can be a case. Of course, we are always trying to reduce the number of third parties we have, so that can create an impact on in the final numbers. But yes, we try to be as updated as possible and relevant. I mean, how relevant some metric can be depends on the country, and we try to be as local as possible.
All right, and Marita, what about at Volkswagen? Since the conduct was back in 2015, or at least the monitorship began in 2015, was the company doing risk assessments before that? or if they were, have they changed at all?
Yes, we have started doing that since 2012, mainly because of the legal reasons, because of the board of management is responsible for the earliest stage discovering of or managing of risks. After the monitorship, we have changed, especially the stage, because we have two different stages. One is assessing the risk, and then we have to test the effectiveness of the controls that we have stated. And basically, after the monitorship, we have to, or we had to, started to really go in details and in more deeper analysis of the controls that we were stating. Before that, we did it, but in a general manner. But after that, we had to go in more details doing that. This is one side of the process that we have. But in another side, what we started doing by middle of 2018 was a process called compliance risk assessment. It is managed centrally, and this is the objective. The aim of that is to see which are the measures and which are the countries, really high risk countries, and brands and businesses that need to apply special measures and controls related to compliance. So I want to split this down, because one part is the mandatory risk management from the legal point of view, and also we have this compliance risk assessment in order to implement these countermeasures. Yes, we have these two kinds of processes in place. An additional one, which is more related to the business, we make in a quarterly base, we collect all the risks that the different areas, the different departments has, and more especially related to risks that, like, for example, the corona is now getting to all of us. So those are risks which are urgent and out of budget, and we need to also report centrally to the board. This is also in order to provide more transparency in the businesses. So we have also, I have to present and discuss this with the board of management, which is one of the recommendations of the monitors. Our participation also, not only with the areas, but also with the board of management. The presence of compliance and risk management in the board of management, it was one of the recommendations of the monitorship.
Okay, great. All right, and which ties back to the structure comments and discussion we had just a minute ago, which is, so your risk assessment is also tied to your reporting lines. And then just for the audience to know, we're not going to go through this list, but we put together a list of common areas that are some of the risks that you would be looking at when you do a risk assessment. For anybody in the audience that hasn't actually done those, because I think it was 24% of the companies haven't started this. When you do, this is just a short list of some of the categories, but our panelists have both talked about other areas that aren't on here that get incorporated into their assessment work. And I think we're starting to get a little bit close to the end. So this slide just talks about what the monitor reviews, but as we just heard from our panelists, they both discussed what the monitor is doing. So we don't really need to go into any more detail here. It's just part of the assessment is figuring out, are you spending the money where you need to? Did you figure out what your risk is and what are the highest level risk? And that's where the money needs to be sent. Everyone knows there's a finite budget, and deciding where to spend the money is part of the overall effectiveness of your program. And then we do have one more survey question that we wanted to ask everybody, and if we could put that up. For the 74% that said they actually do risk assessments, can you answer this question about how frequently you do it? We just heard from Marita where they have a portion of what they do is quarterly. Ramiro, I think, talks about it as an annual, although certain pieces get done more frequently. And so we want to see what everybody else is doing that does have risk assessments. Okay, so I would say it's roughly 8% or 7 have done it just once, and we don't have a question about is that because you've only just started doing it, or if that's the process. 74% follow it every year, 10% do it every other year, and some others have other, and I'm assuming that's because some do it more frequently, or as we just learned that Volkswagen is doing. And then we have one last question, and we'll quickly go to survey number 7. And survey 7 is directed to, now that we know how often you do it, and you all can see the numbers, how often do you think you should be doing it? I think we're okay. All right, I think we're probably that's probably most of the people have responded at this point. And what I want to point out that I find interesting is when we asked how often do you do it, 74% said every year. But now that we've asked how often do you think you should do it, it's 89%. So that number went up quite a bit. Those that did it every other year were 10%, but it appears that actually only 1% believe that they should be doing it every other year as opposed to the 10% that do. And then those the just once, 2 think that just once is how often it should be done. And in the previous question, how many have done it just once, it was 8%. So this was incredibly informative for me, and I hope that it was for everyone else here. And at this point, I think that we've come to the end of the presentation, so I want to turn it back over to you, Matthias, and let us know if there's anything else that anybody wants to ask or how they can follow up.
Yeah. Many thanks, first of all, to you, Pam, and Marita and Ramiro. I learned a lot in this hour and 15 minutes, something like that, and we are still in time. It's incredible, or almost in time. I would like to just add one point to the last point we are talking about, the ethics and compliance risk assessments or risk mappings, which I'm always very interested in, because what I observe in companies is many do a risk assessment, but if they do it, many times they don't do it the best way I think would be possible. And many times it's restricted to pure anti-bribery risks and don't include all the other risks compliance is dealing with today, which is not only anti-corruption, it's environment, as we see with mirada, it's discrimination, whatsoever, labor laws, etc. So I think that could be the topic for another webinar, what to include and how to do it, which is difficult because it's not a typical risk assessment companies are used to, because many of the determinants of the compliance risks are anchored in the company's culture, and that's very difficult to assess and to map. So, but anyhow, I shouldn't even have said that, and read you two of the questions I got here, and please, anybody else who wants to pose a question, do so now in the chat function to me. You can do it in English or in Spanish. One of the questions is put by Fernando Jimenez, and he says, in these COVID-19, we don't have any minute without Corona. It's incredible. In these COVID-19 times, probably many companies will cut the compliance budget and all controls will be relaxed, which inevitably will end with new investigations and sanctions by the control authorities. What is your opinion or advice on this situation? If I summarize it, how could compliance officers convince their boards or other superiors to spend more money on them?
Well, Ramiro, do you want to take this one from the inside view, and I can take it from the outside view afterwards?
I can take that. Basically, what we're trying to discuss nowadays is that all our people is focused on this extraordinary situation when all this pressure comes in terms of numbers, in terms of need to sometimes restructure the organization. We start seeing shortcuts within the compliance group. By shortcuts, I mean people not really remembering that compliance is at the very top of the list as safety for us, right in the oil industry. So it's crucial for compliance to be there, to have that conversation with the leadership, and to ensure that the tone from the top comes with a very strong voice in terms of reminding what we call it at Baker Hughes non-negotiable. Compliance is a non-negotiable, regardless you are in a unique situation as the pandemic, and as we are or in our market, we are also suffering a strong crisis, but still we don't negotiate with compliance, we don't negotiate with safety of our employees or health of our employees. So it's, I think that far from being a moment when we have or can relax, we need to be stronger as ever here.
And I would like to add something. These days I have presented to our colleagues a communication we did that in this time, and especially in this crisis, the compliance of the rules is really mandatory. We have to comply with the rules, because now we are in a crisis, but afterwards we will survive, and meanwhile we have to continue complying with the rules. It doesn't mean that we don't have, or compliance is forgotten because we are now in a crisis. I made a special communication, especially regarding to that they have to take care of the way they share the information, take care of the cybercrime and so on. These are special topics that need to be reminded at this point of time, but also being there to remind them that compliance is important, and especially in this point of time, is important to continue practicing this topic. And well, for me, it's very easy to convince my board because we are in the monitorship. So
yeah. I was just going to say, for those companies not under a monitorship, this will be a real issue. And you are correct, by the way, in saying that there will be investigations that come out as a result of this. And that may not be enough to convince your management, because people are, there is a reality that budgets are being cut because there's not enough money to pay the employees. So things are getting reduced. And my advice is, Marita just hit upon it, which is if your budget's getting reduced, there are things that you can do to remind people what the rules are that is inexpensive. And that is send out those email blasts, make sure you're reminding people what the rules are and what the expectations are of the company. And we're mindful. I know as an outside lawyer, I see clients that are struggling with the same issue. And we are just trying to help them be creative in how to use what is becoming more and more limited resources, which hopefully will get increased after this crisis is over. But in the interim, there are things that can be done just to remind people that don't cost additional money.
Okay, so I have two more questions, one for Pam, and one for Marita and Ramiro. Let's start with Pam. It's a question from Claudio Lopez, and he says, I refer to books violations / manipulation since the FCPA perspective. A violation means inaccurate records in relation of bribe or maybe other facts. And the second question is, what about the bribe between private interests, including government offices?
Okay. So let me take the first question. Under the FCPA, what most people don't understand is that the books and record violation does not have to have anything to do with a bribe. It doesn't have to be a misrecording or a misrepresentation that relates in any way to a bribe. It's quite unusual, and I don't know if it was, I suppose, intentionally drafted that way, but it just means that if there are failures in your internal controls that allow for items to be misreported, whatever they relate to, it is a violation of the FCPA. And most people think that it has to be a recording that relates to a bribe, and it does not. It's just a misrecording, an intentional misrecording in the books and records. And I'm sorry, what was the second part, the question related to?
It's about bribery among
private bribery. So unlike the UK Bribery Act, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act is only related to government bribery. It does not cover commercial bribery. Commercial bribery is subject to other laws that are, I use the word extraterritorial, meaning the US could prosecute companies outside of the US for commercial bribery under different laws, such as under the Travel Act or a wire fraud because it touched US soils. But commercial bribery is not a component of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. It is a government bribery statute.
Okay, thank you, Pat. So the last question is for Maria and Ramiro, and it reads as follows. Do you think that the levels of internal acceptability about your respective compliance programs would have been different without the DOJ monitoring? Marita, what do you say?
Yes, in the past it was, in fact, yes. Without the monitorship, we didn't have this deep level of procedures that we have now. We have really changed a lot. Yes, yes, definitely. My answer is that we have changed, and without the monitorship, we haven't changed nothing, or at least not this level that we are having now.
And Ramiro?
Yes, briefly the same, definitely yes. I would say that we haven't been able to do things without, I mean, some of the things we did without a monitor, but or at least at the pace we did it with the monitor. But as I said before, and now looking at that experience 10 years after he left, I would say that the more we can do it by ourselves in terms of internal compliance, less than putting that on a monitor's request, the better for when the monitor leaves the company, right? Because we will still be there, the monitor will end his journey or her journey, and we will still need to persuade leaders about what needs to be done. So it can be tricky. So we need to be cautious when we have a monitor inside, not trying to blame it on him, everything, because when he leaves or she leaves, we will still need to make a lot of changes and adjustments and improvements to the program, and we need to be able to clarify and persuade leaders about it.
Okay, thank you, Ramiro. Pam, do you want to add something? You sort of start to say something.
The only thing I want to conclude with is that I very much appreciate being invited here, and I really truly appreciate Ramiro and Ramita participating. From a lawyer that's worked as a monitor, I have enjoyed hearing what it's like from the other side more than I think anybody could imagine. So thank you for agreeing to participate and providing such helpful information today for all of us.
Thank you so much, Pam. Thank you very much to you. I enjoyed it a lot. I hope everybody else did as well, and I assume everybody else as well enjoyed it a lot. Thanks, many thanks as well to Marita and Ramiro. You are a fabulous trio to be invited again if you are ready to be there. And we have many, many topics we can still touch upon in next webinars. You will find the presentation, the slides on our center's website, and there you will find as well